Hi guys, welcome to another Q&A video from my take. I know it's been a while. We've got questions on the collapse of China's economy, on the Ukraine war, and on the fall of American democracy. So let's get into it. Alright, so the first question is on the impact of demographics, changing demographics and an aging population on the economies of Europe. The main problem is this, is that you've got the boomers who previously were in their 40s and 50s, were at the most productive point in their lives, producing a lot for the economy and also investing a lot because they didn't have too many kids. Now all of those people are going to retire, and so basically what that's going to lead to is a lot less production and a lot less investment. So suddenly a very small working population will have to support a very large retired population, and at the same time there's going to be less investment in the economy because all those people who are investing are now cashing out their investments so that they can go on pensions. And so basically you're going to see an economic slowdown in European countries, which you've already started to see. At the same time, it's going to become more and more untenable to support the existing pension arrangements that you see. And so you're going to see raising of the pension age, cutting of benefits, cutting of pensions, cutting of the welfare state at large. And because the retirees and old people are still such a large voting bloc, what you'll see is actually that the components of the welfare state that benefit young people are the ones that are going to be cut out more, that are going to be cut off and reduced, because the simple reality is that young people just don't vote in the same numbers as old people. And so the only real way to solve that is to have more working age young people, and there are only two ways to do that. Either have more children, and policies to try and stimulate birth rates haven't worked generally, or it's to bring in more immigration, and that also has some of its problems. It has led to a lot of social tensions. It has led to the rise of hard-right populist parties. And so what you'll see, I think, in European countries is that they will try to stimulate immigration, yes, but in a different way from in the past. I don't think they will try and stimulate as much low-skilled immigration as in the past. They will focus more on bringing high-skilled immigrants that are more easy to integrate, which means that there will be stricter border policies on the Mediterranean Sea, which means we'll see essentially more people dying trying to cross the border, and Europe will have an increasingly protectionist immigration policy. Now the next question is sort of almost a follow-up to that, but then for China. How will the impact of aging demographics affect China's economy? And I think we'll sort of see similar things, but in a very different context. You see, most of the European countries are already very economically advanced, have advanced welfare states. China, of course, has advanced very rapidly economically speaking, but it's still a middle-income country. And the welfare state in China is not as developed as it is in Europe. And much of the growth that we saw in China over the last 40 years was actually a result indirectly of the one-child policy, because what the one-child policy did is it created a huge working-age population of people who all only had one child. And so the population pyramid was very heavily skewed towards working-age people, which really stimulated the economy. But all those people right now are about to retire. Demographers predict that the Chinese population could actually halve within a matter of decades, and the Chinese population is set to shrink very soon. And so basically what that means is that the Chinese sort of manufacturing engine that has driven its economy will no longer be able to work as effectively, because there are fewer workers, and because those workers, because there are fewer of them, will demand higher wages, which means that China's economy will be less competitive. At the same time, because China doesn't have a very developed welfare state, you have a problem that you have sort of the 4-to-1 ratio. So you have one working age child supporting two parents who support four grandparents. And so this, I think, will really be one of the key factors behind a slowdown in the Chinese economy. We should also consider the fact, though, that a slowdown in the rate of growth is not the same as a slowdown in growth. China has been growing at 7, 8, 9, 10% for 40 years because its economy was very small. When a country's economy is very small and underdeveloped, it can grow at extremely high rates. Western countries these days are growing at 1, 2%. So it's almost natural that as China's economy has grown extremely large, the rate of growth will be smaller than what we've seen in the past. But that doesn't mean that the economy will stop growing. Okay, so the next two questions are sort of related, because they both focus on China's economic crisis that it's experiencing now as a result of the property crisis there. And so the first one is focusing on, so how will the economic crisis in China affect China's ability to give loans to countries, for instance, in Africa, but also, Asia and other parts of the world. I think it's going to lead essentially to a decrease in the amount of credit, or at least the ease with which China has given loans in the past. In the past, a lot of the loans that China gave out were frankly to countries or to projects that were not necessarily always economically viable or profitable, because China hoped perhaps that by giving those kind of loans that it could gain political influence. Now, because of the credit crunch in China going on right now, I think China will be more strict on the types of loans it gives and on the amount of loans it gives. So it will give still to, I think, economically viable projects, but I think it will spend less on white elephant projects and things that are not economically viable, because it wants to use that money more for the domestic sector. And the next question focuses indeed on China's mortgage crisis that's going on right now. So basically, the origins of this crisis are quite complicated, but they really could be quite disastrous for the Chinese economy. So basically, in China, the real estate market is a huge part of the economy. So basically, property and everything related to property accounts for 30% of China's GDP. That's huge. And the reason for that is basically the Chinese people have a huge emphasis on home ownership. 90% of Chinese people own their own home. 20% own more than one home. So property has been a huge boost. There has been a huge boom in China over the last few decades. And so what that has led to is basically a property boom. And because of the property boom, people don't only want to buy a home to live in, they also want to buy it as essentially as a speculative or an investment asset. So they see property prices are going up. People buy homes in the hope that they will go up further, which causes those prices to go up further and further, creating an upward spiral. But of course, that can't last forever. And so right now, Chinese households have up to 70% of their wealth tied up in property. And so basically, this huge property craze that has been going on in China, what that led to was a phenomenon called pre-selling. So people were so desperate to buy homes, and supply could not keep up with demand, that people actually would prepay for their homes before they were even built. And that basically led to a lot of irresponsible behavior from property companies like the famous Evergrande, which is one of the largest property companies in China. So what those companies would do is they would receive money from the pre-sales, and instead of using that money to actually build the homes, they would use the money to buy even more land, which they could use, of course, to make even more money. Now, the reason the government didn't put a stop to that is because in China, the local governments receive a huge part of their revenue from basically leasing out land. So basically, the earnings model, the revenue model of the local government was leasing lots of land to property development companies. And so what those companies would do is use the homes that had already been pre-sold as collateral to take out loans from banks to actually build the homes. So in other words, people would prepay for homes. Companies would use that money not to build the homes, but to buy even more property from the government. And then they would take out further loans to actually build the homes. And you can see that this is a kind of Ponzi scheme. It works as long as demand for property is going up and as long as property prices are going up. But of course, with the COVID lockdown and the slowdown in the economy, demand started to go down and companies started to become over leveraged. And so what basically happened is that Evergrande, the largest property company, defaulted on its debt, which caused the whole house of cards to come collapsing in on itself. And basically what it meant is that Evergrande and companies like Evergrande could no longer afford to build the homes that had already been prepaid. And of course, because the people are prepaying for those homes, they've taken out mortgages to build those homes, and those homes are now not being built. That's made people really angry. And so what you have right now in China is massive social unrest. People are basically doing mortgage boycotts. They're refusing to pay off their mortgage until those homes get built. And that's causing serious political instability and making the Chinese Communist Party really, really worried. And so this is really something that could have massive ramifications for the economy, because as I said, 30% of China's economy depends on the property sector. And so if that collapses, it will take the Chinese economy with it. And that will be the first really serious economic crisis that China has faced in its 40-year, boom period, which is really dangerous for the Communist Party because its legitimacy depends on continuing economic prosperity. As long as the Communist Party can provide a good economy, people won't revolt. But if something like this happens, maybe they will. Okay, so the next question is about Russia and Turkey. So Russia is right now building a huge nuclear power plant in Turkey. And you might think, how is that possible? Isn't Turkey supposed to be in NATO? Isn't Turkey supporting Ukraine in the Ukraine-Russia war? And the real reason for that really is that Turkey is a country that has increasingly, while it's of course officially in the Western Bloc, it's part of NATO, it's really trying to pursue an independent foreign policy, basically trying to play both sides. So in the Ukraine war, they've been supplying Bayraktar drones to the Ukrainians, which have really been effective against Russian forces. But at the same time, they've not applied sanctions on Russia. And really, throughout Turkey's geopolitical moves, it has really played both sides. So for instance, they've bought the S-400 missiles from Russia, but at the same time, they're confronting Russia in Libya, in Nagorno-Karabakh, and in Syria. So really what Turkey is trying to do is hedge its bets. It's supporting Ukraine, but it doesn't want to anger Russia too much because Turkey is overwhelmingly dependent on Russian energy. 25% of its oil, 45% of its gas comes from Russia. So this is kind of a way of keeping Russia on side. At the same time, because it's playing both sides, it's able to sort of be in the middle with it when it comes to the Ukraine conflict, which is how Turkey managed to broker the deal between Ukraine and Russia that allows Ukraine to export its grain without being blockaded by Russia. And so for Russia, you could see this as a way of sort of giving a nod to Turkey for its role in negotiating that deal. Okay, staying on the Ukraine topic, the next question is, when will the Ukraine war end? Now, the simple answer is I don't know, and I don't think anyone really knows. But the complicated answer is the war will end when it becomes too costly for both sides to keep fighting, and they cannot gain more by fighting than they can by remaining in peace. And so basically what that means is, if you look right now, a significant part of Ukraine is controlled by Russia. At the same time, the war seems to be stagnating. It's clear that the Ukrainian military is not going to collapse in the face of Russian forces. And so both sides basically think that by continuing to fight that they can win. The Ukrainians think that they can take land back from Russia. And so they will not accept a deal in which they cede, Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, and these kind of areas to Russia, because they believe they can take those areas back. And the opposite applies to Russia, that they believe they can take more areas, or at least secure the areas that they've occupied now. And so as long as that remains, and as long as they can manage the costs of the war, which Ukraine can do because it's receiving aid from the West, and Russia can do because even though there are severe sanctions, of course energy prices remain high, the war unfortunately will continue, and more people will die and more people will suffer. But once it becomes untenable for both sides to continue fighting, and they both see that they cannot gain anything through military means, they will come to the table and some sort of deal will be made, which would likely mean Ukraine perhaps ceding some lands, maybe Donetsk, Luhansk, to Russia. It would perhaps mean Russia withdrawing from certain areas it has occupied, maybe Kherson, Zaporizhia areas. It could also mean Ukraine perhaps agreeing not to join NATO, although that again seems very unlikely. So really, the truth is, I don't know, no one knows, and by my own estimation, this war will continue for a long time. Alright, so the next question is sort of in response to my Sri Lanka video, which of course talked about inflation and how it's affecting a lot of countries. And so the question basically asks, there are a lot of small island countries around the world that either are independent or are overseas territories of other countries that essentially use the US dollar as their currency. They don't have their own currency. And so the question is, are countries like that in a better position to cushion against the global inflation that we're experiencing right now? And I would say the answer to that is yes and no. So the problem with a lot of small island countries is that those type of countries are heavily import dependent. They don't produce a lot, so they need to import food, they need to import energy, which is inflating in price right now. So those countries are likely to be heavily affected by inflation. At the same time, if they have the US dollar in their currency, as their currency, imports are likely to be cheaper than if they had their own currency, because of course the US dollar is overvalued in comparison to those countries' economies. But that of course misses one point, right? So inflation is when prices go up because there is basically too much money chasing too few goods. And there's only really two ways that can happen. So if there's too much money, that's usually a result of money being printed. So there's too much demand but there's not enough production, and so basically the prices of goods go up. But most of the inflation today is supply side inflation. Basically, certain types of goods, for a variety of reasons, because of the COVID lockdowns, because of the breakdown of supply chains, and because of the Ukraine war, those goods are in short supply, and so the price of those goods is going up. And so it doesn't really matter what your currency is, the prices are going to go up anyway. All right, so the next question is asking what news sources I use and what got me interested in politics. So news sources, I really try to, basically the sources for my videos, I try to have a diverse range of sources. So I think what gives a lot of depth to my videos, because I think many of you guys will notice that my videos are quite in-depth, is looking at academic papers, academic sources, reading books, not just the news, because the news only gives you a surface level and often superficial understanding of countries. So for instance, for my Sri Lanka video, I actually went back and looked at the history of the country, not just the recent news reports about the economic crisis, and that gave me, I think, a much more in-depth understanding of the country. So academic sources, and then with news, I try to have sort of a diverse range of sources. Look, all news sources are biased, that's just a fact, but that's not necessarily a problem in itself, because as long as you have a diverse range of sources and you understand what the biases of those sources are, you can still get a very good understanding. So for instance, publications like the BBC, New York Times, The Economist all have their own biases, often pro-Western, often pro-market, etc. But they are still relatively reliable sources. Al Jazeera is also a reliable source, but it also has certain biases which you have to understand and balance with other sources. And then the other thing that I use to make my videos is, of course, my own understanding, my own opinion, and my own analysis. And then basically, as for what got me interested in geopolitics and politics in general, I think I've always been interested in politics. I was raised in a household where from a young age, we were basically speaking about political issues. I was watching the news. I was very interested in history, and therefore also eventually in politics as well. So it's just something I've always loved. It's been a passion of mine. All right, so the next question focuses on the US and looking at sort of the crisis in democracy that's happening there right now. And for instance, the attempts of the Republican Party to increase its power using, let's say, unsavory means. For instance, we know the attempt in 2021 to overturn the election by Trump and his supporters. And basically, this is a very worrying thing. I think in America right now, the level of polarization is so high that increasingly people are basically prepared to overlook the transgressions of their own side, as long as it means that it's hurting the other side. So people no longer care about politics as a means to an end. They only care about politics insofar as it supports their own team. So partisanship is at an all-time high. And so what we're seeing basically is whatever institutional roadblocks prevented the attempt to overturn the election in 2021, all the people who didn't want to give Trump extra votes, all the people who voted to certify the election, etc., all those people right now are being removed or replaced or voted out in Republican heavy areas. And so that's a very worrying prospect, because it brings about the possibility essentially for, by hook or crook, for Trump and the Republicans to take control of the government essentially through legal means, through a legal coup. And basically how that perhaps could happen is using the Electoral College. They could actually overturn the results of the election legally, even if the Democrats would win the majority also of the Electoral College seats. Because technically speaking, the Electoral College does not necessarily have to vote for who the majority of Americans voted for. So if in enough states with Republican-controlled legislatures, they do not vote to certify the results of the election, and instead the choice goes toward the Republican-controlled state legislatures, they could essentially overturn the election. They could use the Electoral College, and now because the Supreme Court is controlled by conservative, mostly Trump-appointed judges, whatever legal dispute would result from this, there's a very high chance that it could be essentially ruled in favor of the Republicans. And that would essentially be a bloodless legal coup, and that would essentially cause a constitutional crisis in America. And if you look at the level of polarization, increasing rise in extremist violence, particularly on the far right in the United States, there's real prospects for social unrest if there is another disputed election in 2024. But, and here's the critical part, none of that matters if the Democrats keep failing and keep doing what they're doing right now, because the truth is that the presidency of Joe Biden has not been a successful presidency. Many things haven't been delivered. The presidency has been slowed by gridlock, by partisanship, by people like Joe Manchin not voting for the necessary reforms that are needed for Biden and the Democrats to actually deliver something to the American people. And so, by all indications, the Democrats are going to lose massively in the midterms, which means that they're going to lose control of the legislature, which means that they will no longer be able to pass any laws, which means that they can't deliver anything at all for the American people, which means that it's very likely that they will be voted out also in 2024. Depending on who runs, Biden is very old right now. He's not very popular, and it doesn't look like there's anyone else waiting in the wings who can replace him on the Democratic side. And if the current inflation continues, the current economic crisis continues as it is right now, if that does not turn around, it's very likely that even without any shenanigans, that the Republicans will win the presidency in 2024. And we don't know what's in store for us, because we know that this is a party that no longer cares about the procedures, and it doesn't mean that the Democrats are good. The problems of the US political system go much, much deeper than which party you support, but it is clear that there is one party that is prepared to even overturn the procedural nature of the system in order to gain more power, and that's dangerous. All right, so the next question is asking me how much I know about Mexico and Mexican politics, and I'm ashamed to say, but unfortunately I do not know very much about Mexico or Mexican politics. I know that AMLO is in charge, and I think the other aspect that's perhaps interesting about Mexico, if you believe what Peter Zeihan is saying, his claim is basically that Mexico actually has a relatively bright future ahead of it because of the current shifts that are happening in global politics. As some of you may know, we're experiencing some level of deglobalization. There's more protectionism happening. The US is looking to shift supply chains out of China because of the rising Cold War with China. And so one of the best candidates essentially to host low-cost manufacturing for the US is Mexico. So Mexico has lower wages, lower costs of business than the United States, and it's conveniently located right next to the United States with a lot of good transport corridors, and there's of course the trade deal NAFTA, which makes trade very easy between those two countries. So Mexico could actually see a lot of manufacturing being shifted away from Asia, especially China, into Mexico to produce for the US, which would of course be beneficial for the Mexican economy and Mexican employment. All right, the next question is from one of my patrons, basically asking what work I do, what are my plans for the future. So basically, I work for an NGO. I don't want to go into too much detail because I don't want to mix work with YouTube. As for my plans for the future in terms of this channel, I think it's to continue doing what we've been doing. It's to continue doing more high quality analysis, high quality edited videos, more deep analysis. Again, all my videos over the last year have been well over 20 minutes. I think we're going to continue that. I think people like the sort of documentary style video. I will try to upload more often. I know I haven't uploaded often enough, and that's mainly because I'm very busy with work, with other things. I think it was easier during COVID to upload more regularly because then, frankly, I had a lot less of a social life and life in general. Now life is coming more back to normal, and so that means there's also less time to do these things. But I do enjoy doing this, and the channel will continue, and we'll try and upload more often. Next question is, do you see yourself moving more from analysis content to commentary content? I'm not 100% sure what the difference between those two is, but I think the style that we have right now going on, I think is the style that I'd like to continue. So I think what I do right now is I take a topic, I explore, the facts of the topic, the things that happen, but I also give my own input, my own analysis, my own opinions. But it's not necessarily a Ben Shapiro style show where I just rant my own opinions. But of course, all my videos do include opinion. They're not entirely neutral, but they do always try to be facts based. Okay, and the final question is actually from the guy who helps me out with this channel, and he's asking me basically, what do I think are my best and worst videos in terms of analysis, in terms of the content of the video, and in terms of the editing style of the video? In terms of analysis, it's honestly a tough one because I think there's a lot of videos that I personally like. In fact, most of my videos I'm quite proud of, but ones that stand out to me, I think, is a video about why Putin won't fall. I think my video about Erdogan was pretty good. The video about African borders, the video about the collapse in South Africa, I think those were some interesting videos. I think one of my older videos that still holds up today in terms of content is actually the police brutality video. I think it was fairly nuanced and facts-based and gave a very different and good perspective, I think, at the time when the George Floyd protests and the topic of police brutality was really coming to the fore. So I think that's also a good one. My worst video in terms of analysis, I would say, maybe it's the video about modern monetary theory and government spending. That was a video I did with a friend of mine together, and it was more like a dialogue. And yeah, personally, I don't like the style that much because the aim of that video was to kind of explore different opinions, and so we each took maybe more extreme opinions that were not necessarily exactly our own as a way of highlighting both sides of an argument, and it looked a bit strange, and I think maybe it made me seem like I had certain views that I don't necessarily have, or that are a bit more nuanced than presented in that video. Then in terms of editing, I think my best video, it's a tough one because of course I always keep upgrading my editing, so each video I try to do better than the next. Of course, some of my videos I think are very good, but they may have one or two glitches in them. I think perhaps the video about why Putin's invasion will backfire, I think editing wise was actually quite a good video, just because it felt very cinematic, and it wasn't about it. It was about an invasion. It was quite dramatic. There were a lot of cool transitions and things like that. Worst editing video, basically any of my very early videos. I'm self-taught in terms of editing, and my first videos are really not good. Please don't watch them. But editing wise, and really also analysis wise, they're not my best videos. But actually, I'd like to hear from you guys. What do you guys think are my best and worst videos in terms of analysis and in terms of editing? Write in the comments below. Alright, so if you enjoyed this video, if you enjoy the content of this channel, please support the channel on Patreon. Thank you very much to the patrons who are already supporting the channel. It really means a lot. Of course, like, share, and subscribe, because this was my take.